Hey everybody, welcome to Diet Wars, the nutrition science where Avi Bitterman and myself destroy our nutrition science enemies on the internet because internet nutrition science is serious business. What we've got for you today is a question and answer session where people asked me many questions in our Discord and we went over them on the topic of the ketogenic diet. We talked about ketogenic diet and weight loss advantage. We talked about ketosis and cognition and mental ability. We talked about ketogenic diets and Alzheimer's disease. We talked about fasting and cognition. We talked about scientific evidence, randomized controlled trials, how to evaluate evidence. We talked about what's underrated and overrated about the ketogenic diet. Underrated, in my opinion, cognition and cancer. Overrated, pretty much everything, especially weight loss. We talked about differences between cults and science. We talked about why does keto diet community sometimes get so upset, and how do you conduct N of 1 trials? What is an N of 1 trial? What is a truly proper and truly rigorous N of 1 trial? And of course, everybody knows it's not. But we talked about that too. We talked about what ketosis is for. Why do human beings have ketosis? What did we evolve that for? What purpose does that serve in our biology if we're out there as hunter gatherers? Is it to be on a ketogenic diet and produce ketones? Is there some other reason that we might have ketosis? And of course, the answer to that is yes, there is some reason. And I talk about how I would have a beer with Ivor Cummins or with Sean Baker any day of the week because they're some of my favorite people on the internet. We talk about leptin and ghrelin and some studies that address leptin and ghrelin, and in particular in the context of, you guessed it, a ketogenic diet. We talk about GPR109A, which is the endogenous deep protein coupled receptor for beta hydroxybutyrate. We talk about anti-cancer effects. We talk about all sorts of different things. And I'm extremely proud of this episode because I listened to it again before I put together this introduction and the outro I'm about to make, and I think I did a damn good job. So, everybody, I just did a great job. Check it out.
So it starts with Mr. X asking, is there any truth to ketosis making weight fat loss faster as opposed to a normal caloric deficit? So I think that different diet types, let's say you only ate donuts and junk food all the time, and then you tried to go into a caloric deficit, you just try to start counting your calories, and through counting your calories, lose the weight that you were hoping to lose. That's going to be a lot harder than a diet that has a different quality, meaning different composition. And so the different foods do different things to you physiologically. And the reason I'm making this into something of a black box, like quality, like what does that exactly mean? What is it that allows you to lose more weight on a higher quality diet than on a lower quality diet? I don't think we exactly know. But the point here is that defined in terms of quality, the thing that allows you to be less hungry whenever you're eating a diet, a ketogenic diet, ketosis, but actually probably just the ketogenic diet, maybe just the ketogenic diet itself, is a higher quality than many other kinds of diets. And for that particular reason, it'll make it easier for you to not eat as much. And that's a little bit, I find it a little circularly. So let's try to get into what exactly it is about a ketogenic diet that might make it easier for you to lose weight than other diets. One thing is, maybe not in the case of the ketogenic diet, but in some ketogenic diets, one thing that affects quality is fiber content. Another thing that might affect quality is protein. The more fiber and the more protein, the easier it is to be satiated on any given diet. And on a ketogenic diet, certainly on the average ketogenic diet, as defined popularly, you are going to have a higher protein intake. And some other qualities are palatability. So, say eating red meat, while many people may think red meat tastes delicious and may taste quite good for many people, it's not as delicious as eating like cheesecake or candy. Or so these foods are even more palatable than many animal foods, especially if we're talking about a ketogenic diet that's animal based. Not all ketogenic diets need to be animal based, but most ketogenic diets, when we're actually talking about ketogenic diets, are animal based. So in these particular cases of animal-based ketogenic diets where the food it doesn't taste as good as the junk food, then you're going to have actually more satiety. Satiety is actually inversely correlated with palatability and through causal mechanisms. So if you eat something that's really delicious, say for example, you have a big holiday dinner, and at the end you're offered ice cream. Well, you might have felt extremely full before you were offered the ice cream, but once you're offered the ice cream, suddenly you have more space for that ice cream. Suddenly your desire to eat, you're not being fully satiated in a certain sense, is less. So you're able to now eat the ice cream and you desire the ice cream greatly. So just desiring foods and having foods that are highly desirable can make it easier to overeat, and having foods that are less desirable can make it less easy to overeat. So another great example of this is what's called the potato diet, or there's a potato hack where you basically just eat potatoes without anything added to them, and many people have reported a lot of weight lost. So those are three mechanisms by which maybe quality is even a bad phrase, but these are three mechanisms by which the ketogenic diet might cause more weight loss than other diets. Another mechanism is sensory specific satiety. So I mentioned the potato diet. If you eat a potato diet and it's just potatoes, eventually you're going to become bored of potatoes and you're just not going to eat as much. Like if you have the rule, I'm only going to eat potatoes, and then you try to do it, eventually you're going to become bored of potatoes and you're not going to be able to eat any potatoes. And since you're not eating anything else, you're just basically going to go hungry. And I've tried and done that before, and many people have done that. Yeah, sensory specific satiety, I guess, would be a fourth mechanism. And there's several other mechanisms that we don't quite understand. The calorie density is another mechanism. So if the calories are simply more dense inside the food, it's going to be easier to eat more calories in a given sitting, and the food is going to be less satiating. So now, to bring it all full circle, if you take a ketogenic diet and you compare it to a standard American diet, in many of these respects, the ketogenic diet is going to be superior. So it's going to lead to weight loss compared to the standard American or the Western diet. The caveat is if you compare a ketogenic diet to other diets that have many of these qualities, say, for example, a whole food plant-based diet that has high fiber content, especially that might have a lot of beans and thus a substantial amount of protein. And then, of course, like they're probably very similar levels of palatability. The calorie density is substantially lower generally in a whole foods plant-based diet, unless you're adding a bunch of nuts. In this case, a whole foods plant-based diet might actually perform better than a ketogenic diet. So the question always is compared to what? Compared to a standard American diet, yes, ketogenic diet for many people is going to cause weight loss. Compared to other healthy diet patterns, is it any better? And I don't think that science has determined that it is. And in fact, this year there's going to be another paper published on exactly this subject, on exactly this question, that I think will troll the hell out of the ketogenic diet community in this respect. But it's I can't share more details about that, but people will very much appreciate this study that is going to come out. So that is the ups and downs of it, which is that the question is always compared to what? I guess one separate sub question related to this is like, does ketosis in itself give somebody a diet advantage? So if you're just by being in ketosis, is this going to somehow suppress your appetite or maybe speed up your metabolism and help you to lose weight? And that's another sort of sub question related to this question I think a lot of people are interested in. And again, the answer to that is complicated because there's been studies that have compared what's called a ketone ester. It's an exogenous ketone. Basically, what that means is you take the ketone ester and it turns into beta hydroxybutyrate, which is the ketone that you produce during ketosis. It turns into your body. Actually, your liver and your gut, they cause that ketone ester to be converted into beta hydroxybutyrate. So then you have a spike of beta hydroxybutyrate levels in your blood, and then your body starts using these ketones for fuel, and they also play a signaling role in your brain and in other places that change in some subtle and perhaps not so subtle ways, different metabolic processes. So what happens whenever you take that on top of a normal diet? Do you get appetite suppression? Well, the study that's looked at this is a study, I think, from 2015 or 2016, and the first author is Brianna Stubbs, and she did this experiment. And what they found was that compared to dextrose, so they had an isocaloric drink that they gave as a control. So they gave one group the ketone ester and another group dextrose, which is the same thing as glucose. It's the same thing that's in your blood when your blood sugar goes up or down. They gave that as a drink as the control. And of course, they made the drinks taste identical, so nobody knew which drink they were getting, so they couldn't report based upon the placebo effect. They were blinded to what intervention they were receiving. They saw that the group that took in the ketone ester had a substantial reduction in appetite compared to the group that took in the dextrose. The problem with this is that dextrose is not an inert placebo. It's not something that doesn't have an effect by itself. So it could be the case that with dextrose, you might have a higher appetite than ketone ester, but that might be because of the metabolic effects of dextrose. Whereas if you gave somebody like the same amount of calories of lentils, would you have appetite suppression? Or let's say you gave somebody, I don't know, 100 calories of ketone ester, 400 calories of lentils versus another group which has just 500 calories of lentils. Would you have more appetite suppression on the lentils plus ketone ester group, or would you have more appetite suppression on the lentils only group, or would they be comparable? And we don't know the answer to this question. So the comparison group is extremely important. What if you gave people just fat, et cetera, et cetera? There's all sorts of other potential control groups that one could have used in this study. Of course, you can't do all control groups in certain studies because you have limited funding, limited resources, all this kind of thing. But the point is that the question is still open because studies like this don't necessarily resolve that question. It does seem that ketogenic diets do, relative to typical diets used in these studies that we're talking about, ketogenic diets do cause lower appetite, more satiety, et cetera. But again, the question is compared to what? Okay, so I think that I've covered that question. Are the reported mental benefits real, not from placebo? I don't think it's ever been shown that there are real benefits to ketone esters for cognition. I think that it has been shown that over the course of a lifespan of mice given a ketogenic diet, which are not just producing ketones, but are also different in several different other ways. For example, they have higher fatty acids, and fatty acids themselves might have effects independent of their ability to produce ketogenesis. So if you put a mouse on a ketogenic diet, you have to give them a very high fat diet compared to a mouse on, say, a low fat diet, which is, it's not going to have a high fat diet and it's not going to produce ketones. But the thing that's causing that mouse to produce the ketones on the high fat diet is the high fat content. But the problem is the high fat content itself might have an effect independent of the ability to cause the mouse to produce more ketones. So what that means is it's about having perhaps more control groups and this kind of thing. So we don't know for sure, but we know at the end of this experiment, they find that the mice that were given the ketogenic diet had much better cognition. And this was repeated twice. This was published in 2016 in Cell Metabolism. The first author on one of the papers was Roberts, and on the second paper, they were published in the same issue because they were very similar studies. The first author on the second paper was either Verdin or Newman, I think. So Megan Roberts and I think it was Verdin or Newman on the second paper. But each of them show a similar effect, enhanced cognition after living on the ketogenic diet for a long time. The interesting part of this is that the Verdin and Newman paper, they put the mice on a high carb diet to test them. So they kept the mice on a ketogenic diet throughout their entire life compared to another set of mice that were not on the ketogenic diet throughout their entire life. In the mice that were on the ketogenic diet for their entire life, before testing their cognition, so I think a week or two before testing their cognition, all of the mice in both groups were put onto a standard diet that was the same between each group, so that being on a ketogenic diet at that moment didn't affect the cognition. We were just going to see what the effect of the ketogenic diet on brain aging was. So like basically the baseline function without any modulation by a ketogenic diet. And they found that the ketogenic diet really preserved really well the cognitive capabilities of the mice that were on the ketogenic diet. So they actually did even better in terms of the memory than the younger mice did. And of course, there was an expected and predicted decline in cognition on the mice that were on the low-fat diet. So that was an extremely interesting finding. It's one of the findings I'm really excited about for the preclinical stuff. There's other problems with this study besides the fact that the ketogenic diet, there's multiple different biological effects of a ketogenic diet besides being ketogenic, as I said, the fatty acids. But there's another problem with this study, which is that in order to keep the mice from becoming obese, because the ketogenic diet, at least in this particular strain, and this is something that is still somewhat mysterious to scientists who work on the ketogenic diet on mouse models, but in some strains, the mice become obese compared to a low-fat diet, and in some strains they don't. Some strains they might even lose weight. In this particular strain, in this particular study, the mice were becoming obese. So what they did was they put the mice on the ketogenic diet for 1 week, then they cycled them back onto the low-fat diet for 1 week, then they cycled them back to the ketogenic diet for 1 week. So they did that throughout this entire course of this entire 2 years. So it's confounded, like these effects are confounded by these sort of fasting feeding effects, which are going to modulate metabolism in all sorts of other unpredictable ways. So there's 3 possible, as far as I can tell, explanations for why this effect on cognition was the case. One is you have this feeding fasting effect. For whatever reason, there's some sort of signaling within the brain or something like that that causes these effects. There's 3 different ways. One is that you have this sort of metabolic modulation through all sorts of different pathways that we probably can only even speculate on that might cause this phenotype, that is to say, this particular effect of not losing cognition with age in these mice. And so we don't know if that's the case, or it could be that the fatty acids themselves had some sort of signaling effect so that they modulated immune cells or something like that, because we know that fatty acids modulate immune cells and modulate immune function. So that might have helped preserve some cognitive function, or it could be the ketones themselves. And so the ketones are thought to be antioxidants. They're thought to maybe even be able to fuel neurons whenever neurons lose the ability over time to process glucose. So even though they weren't on the ketogenic diet at that particular moment, perhaps the fact that they were on ketogenic diet for that previous 2 years, although it was cyclic, but they're on the ketogenic diet for that previous 2 years, allowed them to maintain neuronal function because they were getting the energy substrate that they needed to continue to survive. And so more neurons perhaps survived in the ketogenic diet group mice than in the control group mice. There's a lot of different reasons to speculate on why ketones might have this particular kind of effect on metabolism. On cognition, but it goes back decades, people thinking that this could be the case. Let's actually, though, talk about the trials that have been done, the clinical trials that have been done with medium chain triglycerides in Alzheimer's patients. So medium chain triglycerides are a kind of triglyceride, that is to say, there's something called a glycerol backbone. Think you have a clothes hanger. We'll see if this metaphor works, but we have a clothes hanger, and then you basically attach long strings of hot dogs onto the clothes hanger. In order to transport fats throughout the body to a substantial degree, you actually have to attach the fats onto the clothes hanger, these hot dog strings onto the clothes hanger, in order to transport these fats throughout the body. So a triglyceride is basically 3 fatty acids attached to one sort of clothes hanger. And that's one way to visualize it. And so medium chain triglycerides are basically just fatty acids that are of a medium chain length. They're not very long fatty acids. They're short hot dog lengths, and they're relatively short compared to other fatty acids. But basically, there's these medium chain triglycerides that are taken exogenously. You drink them. And unlike other triglycerides that you might be eating whenever you eat many kinds of fatty meals, you're also eating triglycerides. These triglycerides, because they're relatively short, the chain length is relatively short, they get processed differently by the GI tract and by the liver than the longer chain length triglycerides. And they get processed in such a way that they produce high blood ketone levels. So you can basically just supplement with this specific kind of fat. They're called medium chain triglycerides, or MCTs, and you can buy them at the store. If anybody wants to do this, first off, you need to eat after a meal, like immediately after a meal. Not you don't do it neat, independent of a meal, because you'll have GI symptoms. And then start slowly with low amounts and then increase over time. But the idea is that you're going to be able to just basically automatically raise your ketones in a very similar level as you would when you take ketone esters. So they did these trials with these Alzheimer's patients where first they did a small trial, it was like 50 people. They gave people these medium chain triglycerides. They got their ketone levels up. And then, of course, in the control group that they didn't give them these medium chain triglycerides, they gave them some sort of placebo. So maybe like sunflower oil or something that's very similar to medium chain. It's not the same thing. And so they didn't get their ketones levels up. And then they gave them these cognitive tests and looked to see how well their cognition was doing. And they saw in the smaller trials that the people with Alzheimer's, or it may have been just a pre-Alzheimer's, so like mild cognitive impairment, but I think it was either a mild Alzheimer's or sort of pre-Alzheimer's syndrome. They gave these people the medium triglycerides, and the ones who had the medium chain triglycerides, they were in ketosis, they had better scores on their cognitive tests. So then they were like, that was very exciting. There was a company, I think the company was called like Axion, or I can't remember exactly what it was called. I can look it up for you guys after we're done. Somebody please message me if you are interested. But yeah, they were excited about this. Then they ran another trial, 300 people, and they found no effect. And so what's very common in the Alzheimer's disease literature, and actually this is very common in a lot of clinical trial literature, and Avi, if he wants to, could probably even say even more about this, but often you'll have pilot trials where you'll see an effect of a drug or an intervention, and then when you have a much bigger trial, a true gold standard trial that will really test the intervention in enough people to be confident the effect is real, the effect will go away. This is extremely common in the field, and it's probably not just driven by the fact that you don't have enough subjects. There's probably all sorts of different biases at play in the first pilot trials that cause this to happen. But basically, every time that they've tested this in a really rigorous, large clinical trial, it has failed. This is really disappointing to a lot of people who were in this company and who are investing in this company. And if I'm not mistaken, the company either went belly up or they went a new route. They went a dietary supplement route, and they tried to start selling the medium chain triglycerides not as a medical intervention, but then as a dietary supplement in order to stay afloat. I think that's right. But anyway, they have also done recent studies. There's a group. What's his name? His name starts with a C, but he is one of the big guys in the ketone and Alzheimer's field. So he believes that ketones might be able to treat Alzheimer's. He's done these studies where he has looked at ketones that are radio labeled, and then he'll look at the brain of people who are taking these ketones and see that whenever he gives them the ketones, their brains are metabolizing these ketones at a much higher rate. And what his argument is, and this is supported by some data, is that whenever people get Alzheimer's disease, they can't metabolize glucose as well. They're impaired in metabolizing glucose, and this might be driving a lot of the disease. So if you can't metabolize glucose and your brain runs on glucose, which we talked about this last time if some of you guys were here, but basically your brain runs only on glucose. It doesn't run on fatty acids. It can run either on glucose or ketones, but it doesn't run on fatty acids. Most of the other body can also run on fatty acids. Your heart preferentially, I believe, runs on fatty acids, but your brain cannot run on fatty acids. So if your brain no longer has the ability to metabolize glucose and you don't have a lot of ketones available, then you're going to lose function in the brain over time. Maybe even your neurons will start to die. And the hypothesis is that Alzheimer's is in part, maybe not caused by this, but one of the downstream effects of Alzheimer's, perhaps accumulation of amyloid and or tau and these other proteins that are thought to be involved in Alzheimer's. One of the downstream effects is impairment of glucose metabolism and thus an impairment of cognitive function. So if you replace the glucose with ketones, if you can then supply ketones to the brain because the brain can't use glucose, but it can still use ketones, then maybe you can rescue or save some of this impairment and restore normal brain function. That's like the hypothesis that goes back decades. There's still a guy who's working on this. He's shown that whenever you give people ketones, they start to metabolize these ketones at a much higher rate. So conceivably, you might get these improvements in cognitive function. And there's also another guy named Swerdlow at Kansas State, I want to say, who also of School of Medicine. I think he's a neurologist. I've talked to him a little bit. He's done trials on the same effects. But let me talk about this guy who's shown that ketones are used more in the brain of Alzheimer's patients. Well, they are used more in the brain of Alzheimer's patients, but still, whenever you do the cognitive tests, you don't see any effect. Actually, in his latest paper, I think it was published last year, they showed that if you give them like 30 or 40 different tests, like a couple of them improve, like one or two gets worse. And so what they did for that study is like, oh, look, this particular test, one of them was like the Boston card call test or something like that. And it was basically like, if you're shown like 60 different cards, how many can you recall? And the Alzheimer's group patients ended up recalling one more card on average, which is a statistically significant effect. If you give people 40 different tests, by chance, some of those tests are going to be statistically significant. And so if you do the proper adjustments on those tests, you actually find that those effects were actually statistically significant. So even in the conclusions of the paper itself, they say that they need to run a more adequately powered clinical trial. So the other group, the Swerdlow group in Kansas State, their trial wasn't randomized. It was a single arm trial. And so it's not really gold standard evidence. And I don't think anybody in the medical community looking at any drug would ever accept that as evidence for the efficacy of an intervention. So the bottom line is that everybody, although we have some very interesting, plausible mechanistic reasons to believe that ketones might improve cognition in Alzheimer's disease, we haven't yet, in a very rigorously controlled large trial, ever shown that it does without having to invoke post hoc analyses and all the sorts of other things which are observational and are not considered admissible evidence in any drug trial or in the medical community. So lots of really great mechanisms, but no strong evidence. Whenever you look at fasting, people who fast and they get their ketone levels up, you actually tend to see a reduction in cognition and a reduction in cognitive ability. So one of the questions is what if people fast regularly, though? They've never done that study as far as I've been able to find. So they haven't done a study on people who fast every day for a month and then look at the end of the month if their cognition is still impaired when they're fasting. They've only done studies where they fast people for like a week, not a week straight, but like every day for a week, or even just they fast them once and then they show an impairment. So maybe there's some sort of adaptation so that you do actually get an increase in cognition. My guess, although I don't know, because we do need to actually test it, whether fasting does increase cognition like after longer than a week or 2 weeks. And it may have actually been done. It may have turned out negative. I'm not sure recalling, but I can't actually, what I'm saying is I can't actually recall a trial that has turned out positive. And I've looked really hard. So I've not been able to find that. So, but we need to do, more of those studies, and perhaps somebody will find it with a more chronic fasting protocol. My guess is that what is actually happening, and I did basically OMAD for 2 years, like one meal a day. Sometimes I do 2 meals a day just because I was eating like 1,000 calories a day. I was like a skinny rail because I like read too much Walter Longo and watched his interviews too much. So I basically would just eat like 1,000 calories a day, and I was like really, 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 really thin. And I thought that I had great cognition whenever I was fasting as well. Listen, if you're going to go that hardcore about fasting and you're going to be like, I'm going to go fast for, for like 16 hours and I'm just like not going to eat until like the early afternoon, I'm going to wake up and I'm not going to eat the entire time of the afternoon. You're so committed to that paradigm of doing that you're going to really want to believe that your cognition is better. And to be sure, whenever you do fast like that, you do feel different. Like you have more stress hormones, more cortisol, more norepinephrine. So you are modulating your mood. You are modulating your brain function. That might be more of just a kind of a sensation or a psychological feeling than a necessarily being able to do better on a test. So a lot of people, as we know, they'll be able to be sleep deprived for, they'll only sleep 3 or 4 hours a night, and they'll do that for weeks, and they'll say they feel just fine. But when you actually test them on actual real tests, that you show that they're not doing just fine, they tend to do much more poorly. So just going based off of how you feel is not a great way to look at it. And I don't think we actually have any really rigorously controlled studies that have shown objectively that people who have higher ketones, whether through fasting or the ketogenic diet, actually have better cognition. And I think most of the studies point in the opposite direction, but it's still a possibility. And hopefully it could be true. But again, I do have some hope for this idea that chronic elevations in blood ketones might be able to slow down cognitive aging, because cognitive aging is something that happens to all of us, and it would be nice if we could figure out a way for it not to happen. What is overrated and underrated about keto by most low carbers versus high carbers? I think underrated about keto would be maybe the potential cognitive benefits and especially cognitive aging. And then maybe anti-cancer benefits, which I think, I'm not going to say that they're real. That's a whole long discussion. I think that if you're looking at the animal models, most of those studies are done poorly. And especially if you start looking at the very modern guidelines for how animal studies should be conducted to get very rigorous results. Basically, all of them are not done properly. And that's animal studies in general. It's not just ketogenic diet studies, but I think actually ketogenic diet studies have their own set of unique problems because usually the ketogenic diet is not properly matched to the control diet. So the control diet will be, say, 20% protein. The ketogenic diet will be like 5% protein. Well, you're changing more than just the fatty acids, and then you're also changing the protein. And actually, you end up changing like 20 or 30 different vitamins. And so you have like 20 times the amount of choline in the control versus it becomes really, the diet design is really poorly done. And I don't think that's necessary. I think that it could be the case that they could be done very well. So I'm doing some ketogenic diet studies right now with diets that have been formulated very well. They're perfectly matched. In most cases, they're not in this literature. So like 90% of the cases, they're not. But in some of the cases that they have looked at this, where they have properly matched protein and other nutrients, they have seen a trend towards an effect of an anti-cancer effect in what's called a xenograft model, which is basically injecting tumor cells into these mice. They didn't see an effect, but that might because they didn't see a statistically significant effect in this case, but that might be because the power was not sufficient, so they didn't have enough mouse numbers. When you look at these other studies that I've been talking about earlier with respect to cognitive aging, these long-term studies, they've also seen a trend, at least in Verdin and Newman, they saw a trend, a very close trend, almost statistically significant for ketogenic diet being better than the control diet in tumor prevention. So this is spontaneous tumor formation, not in any sort of weird tumor model or some sort of preclinical model that we don't actually know the relevance to humans, but spontaneous tumor growth. Of course, mouse tumors are not the same as human tumors, but the fact that they're spontaneous does make us a little more confident that the biology might be somewhat similar to the human spontaneous tumor biology. And I think the Roberts case, I think they did see a statistically significant difference in spontaneous tumor growth, and that's found in the supplement if you want to look in that. So that's super interesting, and these were secondary analyses, but the results are somewhat consistent in even the studies that have been done well. So I think there's some promise for potential anti-cancer properties of a ketogenic diet. On the other hand, if you look at, say, saturated fat intake and LDL levels, so saturated fat intake tends to be correlated with breast cancer. That's been observed in several different studies. And actually, maybe Avi could maybe disabuse me of this meme if I'm wrong about this. Please interrupt me anytime you think that I'm wrong, Avi, about saying something like this. But my understanding is that there's been a somewhat consistent effect found between intake of saturated fat and breast cancer. And in Mendelian randomization, if you look at LDL levels, which are increased by saturated fat intake, you also find an association between genetically elevated LDL and breast cancer, and maybe some other cancers as well. So I think probably the devil's in the details. Okay, so yeah, so it may be the case that it depends on what fatty acids that you're using. Maybe some fatty acids to produce a ketogenic diet are going to be better than other fatty acids. So maybe saturated fatty acids are a bad idea, which is kind of very different from what most people do. But the other problem is that mouse immune systems are not quite the same as human immune systems either. So it could be a mouse phenomenon, which would be a drag. And so we don't have any good evidence at all, really. We don't have any evidence, I don't think, that in humans, even epidemiological evidence that in humans, like serious carbohydrate restriction will reduce cancer incidence. I think the best evidence we have in humans for cancer incidence and for cognition is just having a high quality diet, a healthy diet. I think that anybody who is using a ketogenic diet, say more maybe an Atkins type diet, there's some question whether that's a high quality diet in terms of health. So I would say if you are going to go experiment with this and you want to see if you can achieve some modest benefits to longevity and to aging without much human evidence at all that we have, you would want to go on a ketogenic diet that is in a healthy diet pattern, which is a ketogenic diet that has, as its sources of fats, more nuts and seeds and less meat. And you want to make sure you get your fruits and vegetables. Of course, they're going to be low carb fruits, but you can get a modest amount of berries, for example, and try to make it a very healthy ketogenic dietary pattern if you're going to try it. But I think there's a lot of promise. I'm really excited about it. I just think we also need a lot more evidence, and I look forward to that being the case in the coming years. So, and then what's overrated about keto? Everything's overrated about keto. Like, I would say weight loss is overrated about keto. But we need to place it in the context of, again, compared to what? Like compared to a standard American diet, or compared to a whole foods plant-based diet, especially one that I think should be higher in protein. Yeah, I think it's definitely overrated. It's overrated on lipids. Like, yeah, you're going to get your insulin levels down, you're going to get your HDL up, and then you're going to get your triglyceride levels down. But you're also going to get higher LDL levels, and you can also achieve most of the benefits of a ketogenic diet on blood lipids that are reported, say lower insulin levels, better triglycerides, better HDL, etc., just by losing weight and having a higher quality diet in general. Actually, you can get, I wouldn't even say you get most, I would say you probably get almost all of those same exact benefits without getting the elevated LDL cholesterol, by simply losing weight and being in better physical shape. Now, if a ketogenic diet is your only path to do this, is that the only way that you think that you can do this? Again, you want to try to emphasize plant-based sources of fats rather than animal-based sources, because you want to avoid the negative impact of higher higher LDL levels. So yeah, I think that's a little overstated on lipids. And then what else? One of the ways that ketogenic diet is really healthy is a really good medical treatment is for epilepsy. That's pretty well established and very widely accepted in the medical community, that ketogenic diet can be very helpful for epilepsy. But that might be a very different ketogenic diet than the one that you might eat if you read an Atkins book or a Dr. Berg book or whatever. Athletic performance is not that great, except maybe in ultra distance type events. Anything else, I would tend to avoid a ketogenic diet unless you are starting from a standard American diet, in which case eating a ketogenic diet, which is going to be associated with higher protein intake, will probably cause muscle mass gains and will improve performance indirectly through that mechanism. But if you did the same thing on a higher carbohydrate diet, that is to say a higher protein intake on a higher carbohydrate diet, you would see the same benefits without the downside of not being able to access carbohydrate metabolism. And the problem with athletics in the ketogenic diet is not being able to access carbohydrate metabolism, because you don't have the carbohydrates on board. You don't have the glucose in your muscles or in your liver. You're not going to be able to do high intensity type athletic things. Like you're not going to be able to sprint. So say if you're a grappler or if you do jiu-jitsu, like you're not going to be able to go for a minute really hard grappling, because you're going to get worn out because of your lack of glucose. But it might not be so much of a problem in the case of ultramarathon events. But again, and ultramarathoners also carbohydrate load before their events, even if they're on a ketogenic diet. So Zach Better, who's a very famous ultramarathoner, very well accomplished, he does carbohydrate loading before his event. So he's not restricting glucose metabolism. Okay, so let's see. Is there anything else? If anybody has anything else, any other topic on keto that you want me to talk about, overrated versus underrated, I can do that. One last thing, type 2 diabetes. I'm not 100% convinced that the improvements in blood glucose levels on a low carbohydrate diet are not driven by the weight loss. So I'm not sure that a diet that achieves a similar level of weight loss as any other diet, ketogenic diet that achieves similar levels of weight loss of any other diet, is going to be any better for a type 2 diabetic than a ketogenic diet. But I think it might depend on how far the type 2 diabetic is. So if a type 2 diabetic is 20 years, 30 years type 2 diabetic and doesn't have any beta cells, maybe it might be very useful. Anyway, that's that we still need to work out, and there's going to be some studies coming out this year on that topic. Let's go on to the next thing. Chris Kresser. So levels of low, medium, high carbohydrate intake. Somebody's asking, Avi lapped at Kresser's levels of low, medium, high carb, 10 to 20 to 30%. While they are not what studies use, some do. It is what low carbers are actually doing. Is there a consensus on levels? At 30%, I can eat donuts, pizza, hamburgers, fries in the same day. Right. Low carbohydrate forces whole food, unprocessed choices. Unfortunately, low carb processed foods are coming.
Here, I can answer this one. The issue here is that he can have his own whatever definition he wants of low carb or high carb. That's not really the issue. He can have whatever proprietary definition he wants. And he can even argue that, well, if this is what people who say they're low carb are actually doing, he can try to say, well, this is the better definition. That's fine. The problem is when he cites studies, he can cite a study and say, okay, well, here, look at all the benefits of low carb. And then when you actually look at that study will be like, oh, low carb was under 40%. Well, if low carb was under 40% in that study, and he's using that study to support low carb, and his definition of low carb is like under 20% or 15 or something, that's what is laughable, because that's inconsistent.
Yeah.
It's not that the problem is not that he has a different definition. The problem is not that he makes up his own definitions, even though that is a little bit funny, but the real problem is when he has his own separate definition, he's defining low carb as something else, and he's using studies that define low carb as something completely different to support what he's defining low carb to be, which is completely different. Does that make sense?
Yes. And I would just say, like, take Chris Kresser's citations and arguments with a grain of salt and with anything that he writes, because he's not the most careful scholar on the internet. I agree with Avi. I think that, and that sounds like something Chris Kresser would do. Is there a consensus on level? Well, so generally consensus is something like below 50 to 100 grams. That's a ketogenic. That's a very low carbohydrate diet. I think below 150 grams this is sort of like the Stephen Finney, the what's his name, Jeff Volek, and the Eric Westman kind of approach. Anything below 150 grams is low carb, right? So 50 to 100 grams is very low carb. 150 grams low carb. And so 50 to 100 grams could also be ketogenic. So they call it ketogenic, very low carb. Okay, yeah. And then 150 low carb. So that's like the accepted definition. And of course, there's other definitions because the the ketogenic diet goes back to the 1920s. It was developed in the 1920s for epilepsy. And so there's other medical definitions for ketogenic diet for epilepsy in particular. But the popular version of the low carb diet, which is defined essentially by Volek, Finney, Westman, and those guys today, that version is generally thought to be below 550 to 100 grams of carbohydrate, or maybe below 150. Well, on the internet, of course, most people are not going to accept below 150 anymore. It's a strange issue that I don't even want to talk about because I'm just going to start sneering at people. So I think it would be a good idea to move on to the next question. What is the underlying mechanism by which ketosis may improve cognitive status? I think, yeah. So it could be immune modulation, I touched on. It could be antioxidant capacity. It could be providing alternative energy substrate to cells that might be impaired. It could be what we're talking about earlier, the cortisol norepinephrine levels. So we know that one of the mechanisms through which, for example, I think many ADHD medications work is by increasing norepinephrine. So maybe that could be another mechanism, especially when you're talking about fasting. I'm not sure if norepinephrine goes up. I'm not sure if it goes up during a ketogenic diet. Somebody will have to look that up. I believe the catecholamines are changed and modulated by the ketogenic diet, but I can't remember exactly how that works. But yeah, so those are some of the mechanisms, and I don't know what causes this. I know we've all experienced this. After you eat, you sort of go into this like coma. Some people say it's like insulin and tryptophan, and there's all this other mechanisms. But maybe by not eating, you just don't have that. So that's another mechanism potentially. Weight loss also, of course, whenever you're losing weight and you've lost weight, you have less overall inflammation in the body, and inflammation is a brain to go into what's called sickness syndrome. Sickness syndrome happens, everybody knows when you get the flu, you don't want to go out, you don't want to talk to anybody. No matter how much coffee you drink, you can't seem to get yourself up to do anything. So inflammatory signaling molecules, like it's called cytokines, basically inflammatory. They're like your cells secrete these molecules that then signal to the rest of your body that you're in an inflamed state. It signals to your immune system. It also signals to your brain. It'll cause your brain in particular to maybe not function well. So whenever you lose weight, then perhaps, I think this is a very plausible hypothesis for why weight loss improves the way you feel. You feel better, is that maybe you have fewer circulating inflammatory molecules, so you have less of a sort of chronic sickness, chronic subacute, like subclinical sickness syndrome going on because you have gotten rid of those inflammatory molecules. I hope that makes sense, because those inflammatory molecules are mediating your sickness syndrome with flu, so they presumably could also mediate a sort of quasi or subclinical sickness syndrome especially if you're grossly obese and you have a lot of inflammation. Okay, so can you give us a name of someone doing a study so we can look at someone doing a study? Yeah, Kevin Hall. So check out Kevin Hall. Kevin Hall is the one where he's looking at sort of whole foods, plant-based type template versus sort of animal-based low carb template, like ketogenic versus very high carb, very low fat, and that's going to come out. He is a metabolic ward study lasting a couple of weeks. It's really interesting, and you can actually find out looking at the clinical trial registration online what it's studying, so you can get an idea of what we're talking about. What counts as a ketogenic diet? Yeah, I think I kind of touched on that, which is below 50 to 100 grams is per day. But another way of characterizing is anything that gets your blood ketone levels consistently above 0.5 millimolar. Sorry, your beta hydroxybutyrate levels. And of course, there's some controversy about whether this is the right way to do it. But it's generally accepted today, conventionally, that above 0.5 millimolar blood ketones will be considered ketosis. You're in a ketotic state, and nutritional ketosis in particular. And somebody else can ask another question about this, but I want to just introduce this because we didn't talk about this time, is that the reason we have ketosis is because it's an important part of fasting metabolism. Without ketosis, without being able to go into ketosis in a fasted state, we would not survive starvation for as long. If anyone wants to talk about exactly why that is, you guys can ask, and I'll try to get to that. Okay. Are we debating Saladino on the podcast? Hey, I've tried to be really nice to Saladino. Like, I've bent over backwards like crazy for that guy over direct messaging. I've tried not to like say anything like, "Oh, you're not going to debate with us. You're afraid." I've not done anything like that. He seems open to doing it. I don't know if it's going to happen. If it happens, that'll be cool. Other keto people don't seem to want to do it, and I understand why they would not want to, right? Like if somebody else was saying what I think is quackish, or it's not science, or blah blah blah, which I've been saying for a while about a lot of these people, I wouldn't want to debate them either. However, the fact is they think that I'm, full, like I don't know what I'm talking about, but I'm willing to debate. And I wrote, I think this is something I came up with that describes the situation. I tweeted just now, and I think this is correct. Science and cults each challenge widely held beliefs in society. So they're challenging widely held beliefs in society. Science and cults both do that. The difference is in their response to criticism. Science thrives on criticism. Science welcomes criticism. Criticism is the way that science is done, right? Whereas cults see criticism as a threat and close themselves off to it. So many of these people who are complaining about me and saying, I won't debate, they won't debate me because I'm a jerk, right? Many of these people blocked me like years ago, right? Many of these people, like Sean Baker, almost immediately blocked me as soon as I ever said anything to him. Amber O'Hearn immediately blocked me. Ivor Cummins launches into ad hominems all the time. Now, I'm not going to say I'm like a nice guy. I'm not like neutral whenever I talk to people at all. If I think that what you're saying is not according to science, I'm going to say it. And if I think it's quackish, I'm going to say it. But I think that this community is very closed. It doesn't engage with the scientific community. These people don't say, "Hey, I'm going to go and get a PhD to try to prove my point," or even just try to get the credibility of the credentials, or to try to figure out what other people who think differently from me think. They don't do that. What they tend to do is they try to find people who already agree with them. They get together in these conferences and they talk to each other, and then they tend to insult everybody who's outside of their subculture. In fact, they have whole conspiracy theories about why we're all bad, right? I'm thoughtless or malevolent. And everybody who's not in their cult, I think it's a cult because they're closed off, is this. And I think that this is a shame. Like, even if I call them quackish, at this point, I'm open to talking to them. And I'm even open to talking to them on an unrecorded basis. I've talked to Gary Taubes. I once had a conversation over the phone for 3 hours with Gary Taubes, and I like Gary Taubes very much as a person. I don't think what his stuff does is good, but if we're talking just over the phone, one-on-one, I could have a beer with Ivor Cummins. Like, I literally could have a beer with him if he would just drop the ego, which I think he would if we were just having a beer and we weren't around a bunch of other people. So I have no personal problem with them. I'm open to talking to them anytime, anybody, Paul Mason, whatever, and I'm open to doing so in a very civil way. I just think we're going to win on the facts, and it's not going to be great for them, but if they want to get together 10 of their people to do it at the same time and see if they can win, make them look like they're smart and they're better than everybody else or whatever they want to show, they can do that too. So I'm open to having a civil discussion. If somebody wants to ask me about what I've said in the past about like LDL or about other aspects of low carb, I'm going to tell them that I think the fact that they deny LDL is important is a huge problem. It's quackish. It's always going to exclude for them from the mainstream. And so long as they do it, they're always going to be excluded from serious discussion with serious people. And I'm one of the only ones who's actually engaging with them at a high level. Okay, so let's move on to the next thing. Okay, Amber O'Hearn, so here's what I don't know exactly what happened, why she blocked me. Like what happened is I would say to her that she needs to do a crossover study with her particular diet. So crossover is very easy. There's something called an N of 1 crossover. It's like a legitimate scientific approach. Papers are published on this. basically you control all of the conditions that are relevant to your intervention. Then you do your intervention. Then you stay on it, say, for 2 or 3 weeks or however long you need to do it. And then you go back to not doing it. And then basically the idea is you see the symptoms go away when you do the intervention, and they come back when you go off. And then you go back on the intervention again. So it's called ABAB. That's one way to establish causality in a single person is you off the intervention, on the intervention, off the intervention, on the intervention, because then you rule out, especially if you did it another cycle, right? You rule out the possibility that correlation was responsible for the effects. Now, this doesn't get rid of the potential for placebo. And so ideally, you'd also have blinding as well. I'm not sure how you do that with diet, but conceivably it could be done. So what I asked Amber is, why don't you do a crossover study, like an ABAB study, and then report the effects in a rigorous way so that we can be sure that the reason that you see these benefits from the ketogenic diet or from this carnivore diet that she's talking about is not because of a lot of other things you changed at the same time, so that now you have all these confounders, and it's not just the carnivore diet that's changed that's causing the effect, but these other confounders potentially. But you actually go back and forth in a really short and period of time, these different diets, and then see if the symptoms go away and then come back. And I said, the reason you need to do this is because you are giving these recommendations out to large numbers of people. And if you are giving out these recommendations to large numbers of people, there could be serious health consequences of that, especially if you're wrong. And there are negative health consequences to eating a carnivore diet. For example, high meat consumption might increase risk of cardiovascular disease and cancer. So she didn't think that this was a good idea. I don't exactly understand like why this wasn't a good idea to her, why she didn't want to do this, but she didn't want to do this. And then she called me emotional. She said I was being emotional, and she blocked me. Presumably it's because she thought I was letting like my ethics get in the way of science. But for me, like, the point of what we're doing is to help people. It's not to just sort of abstractly determine what the best, like what is the proper diet for human beings. It's like, it's actually to figure out whether these things will have a positive or negative impact on people. So I'm concerned with, if I give diet advice out based on things that I believe personally, I'm concerned that I might actually be hurting people with that advice. So I want to have really solid evidence behind what I think in order to make that advice. One way of having that in her particular case would be to do this crossover trial. So it's not me being emotional or letting other considerations in the way. The whole point of me doing what I'm doing is to help people. The whole point of science, from my point of view, the purpose of it is not abstract truths about what the best diet is for human beings for no reason except just having the abstract truth. The point is to actually make a positive impact on people, and I want to be dead sure that I'm making a positive impact. So she said I was emotional. She blocked me. I don't understand why she's like that. And of course, we have the whole Kim Berry people who think that because I said something bad about Kim Berry once, which I shouldn't have said, I apologize for. And that was a mistake. And I basically, like, whenever his house burned down, I was like, there's cosmic justice in the world, thank goodness. And I shouldn't have said that because I think that that's not the right attitude to have. So yeah, and then so people just want to take that and then use that as a way to never engage with me ever again either, even if I, whatever else. So I think it's really just a way for them to close off from me and not talk to me at all. So that's my guess. Tufano, I'd be happy to talk with Frank Tufano. Frank Tufano wants to come on the Diet Wars podcast, let's have him. If somebody knows him and wants to invite him, he'll be on. It'll be a civil and friendly conversation. I just think that it's not going to go well for him in terms of the actual arguments, but if he wants to come on and do that, I think that would be great. And I think I would probably learn a lot because Frank's a smart guy. I think some of the things he says doesn't make sense to me, but I think he's an exceptionally bright person within this diet space. Although, again, I think that what he does is kind of wacky. It's a little crazy. Come on, he eats raw meat.
I don't think he's bright.
You don't think he's bright?
No.
Okay. Well, I also can be kind of credulous, naive. So like, I tend to think people are smarter than they are. And so over time, I'm often disabused of that idea. And yeah, I think that that's probably part of the problem as well here. So I wouldn't be surprised if you're right. So
he's one of the least bright people I've come across. He's
really. So what about compared to Tucker Goodrich?
I mean, Tucker Goodrich. I mean, yeah, they're probably equal level, I would say.
Oh my goodness. Okay. All right. Maybe my judgment's wrong here. All right, let's keep going. What are the dangers and pitfalls of a ketogenic diet? Dangers is LDL levels, and potentially other things in meat that we don't know. I mean, this is a little more speculative based on more preclinical and observational evidence, but there's thought to be potentially other things in meat that are actually also cause negative health outcomes. I mean, these are memes that Avi wants to see die, right? But I think evidence for TMAO is pretty weak as far as everything I've ever read. But perhaps the heme iron, perhaps the sulfated amino acids, so methionine and cysteine. So it's thought that those might drive anabolic processes in the body that eventually cause cancer. And so you want to limit those to a certain degree.
I don't buy that either.
Okay, yeah, okay. There might be some mechanisms besides LDL lowering and raising that are responsible for some of the negative effects of meat, apart from, so at least the LDL raising and lowering, I think, is the biggest danger. And then there's these potential speculative other potential dangers, but that are not well established by science. Okay, so that would be the biggest one. Also, thyroid. I think this is a legitimate reason. So thyroid levels, especially T3 levels, you're going to get less conversion of T4 to T3. That's been shown by several studies on ketogenic diets. And so the potential of people who are at baseline of a lower thyroid function going even lower in their thyroid function and thus getting subclinical hypothyroidism is substantial. Yeah, that's another potential problem. But I think the biggest problem is probably LDL levels. But energy levels and thyroid levels are a potential problem as well. After a couple of months of ketogenic diet, I don't feel well. So maybe that might be the reason. That's an open question. But anyway, thyroid, LDL. Okay. How does keto just help you survive starvation? Your brain can only use glucose or ketones. The rest of your body can use glucose, ketones, or fatty acids. When you're starving, your body doesn't have access to glucose. So it needs to get its glucose from your muscle. Your body wants to avoid getting glucose from muscle as much as possible, because the more glucose that you take from muscle during starvation, the faster your muscle is going to wither away, and eventually, if you lose enough body protein, you're going to die. If your body depended entirely on glucose, because remember, it cannot use fatty acids. If it depended entirely on glucose, you would live maybe about 12 to 18 days before about half of your protein stores were depleted, because your protein needs to turn into glucose. And then when about half of your protein stores are depleted, you die. So you'd have a fasting resistance or a starvation resistance of about 12 or 18 days if you could only use glucose in your brain, because again, you cannot use free fatty acids. Ketones are an alternative energy source to glucose, which your brain can use whenever they're available. And I think they're preferentially used by the brain whenever they're available. Ketones allow you to spare glucose. So instead of breaking down your muscles to generate glucose for your brain, your body will break down your fatty acids, transform them, convert them into ketones. So you convert your fat into ketones, and then your body then use your ketones, your fatty acids indirectly via ketones. Your body can then use your ketones to substitute for the glucose. So this allows you to maintain your muscle mass. You don't die within 12 or 18 days. And in fact, people have fasted for as long as, I think, almost 400 days. There was a study written up in the 1970s where an obese guy went from like 400 pounds to 180 pounds after a fast of like 400 days. And that is all because of ketones. If he did not have ketogenesis, he'd be dead within a couple of weeks. And so muscle sparing allows you to be tolerant to starvation. And incidentally, or not incidentally, but probably centrally to this whole understanding of the role of ketones in starvation, humans are among the most ketogenic of the mammalian species, and this probably relates to the energetic demands of the human brain because of its size. So that's a really interesting tie-in. All right. Would I also smoke a joint with them? With what? Ketones? Would I smoke a joint? Well, Ivor? No, I would not smoke a joint with Ivor, because we would get into a terrible argument. That would be terrible. It would be the worst experience in the world. I would drink a beer. I wouldn't smoke a joint. So Amber O'Hearn, I don't like Amber. And Sean Baker, I'm even happy to have a drink with Sean Baker. All right. So is this a study that from Kevin Holler talking about? Let's look at it. The processed versus unprocessed diet is the old study that he recently, I want to say last year, published. I want to look at this one. Low fat versus low carb on metabolism. Last date posted for recruiting. Yeah, this is yeah, this is it. Yep. This is it. This one, it's the how to get the identifier. The identifier is NCT 03878108, and that is going to be a really cool study whenever it comes out. It's going to make people's brains explode, especially like keto zealots. All right. There's a question I had up for a long time. Isn't the most important thing to be fat adapted? Okay. Isn't the keto diet only a tool to achieve this and not a diet to keep long term? Being fat adapted, I'm assuming that you mean that you want to be fat adapted because you want to burn fat instead of like carbs. Because if you burn fat, then you're able to burn your body fat. And if you're able to burn your body fat, then you're able to lose weight. So the idea behind a ketogenic diet would be that you get into a ketogenic state because then whenever you go into a calorie deficit, your body can very easily access the fatty acids that you have already stored in your body and then lose weight. Because if you were on a high carb diet and you then went to a calorie deficit, then your body would be like, hey, where's the carbs? I'm not ready to burn fat. I'm prepared for the carbs. Let me go eat something. And so that's the idea behind why a high carb diet might not be as beneficial for weight loss as a ketogenic diet, because your body's just not ready to start burning fat when you go into a calorie deficit. That would be my sort of charitable way of understanding it. I think that it's an interesting idea. I think people lose weight on all sorts of different diets. I don't think any diet has been shown to be easier or worse to lose weight on than other diets, so long as the quality is similar and you're in a calorie deficit. But I can see what you're saying, and I think that there's some sort of intuitive and also some sort of experiential like feel behind this. So, for example, I once had an experiment where I only ate lentils, but I was tracking exactly how many calories I was taking in, and I was taking in a deficit. I was like taking in like 2,000 calories, whereas my resting metabolic rate is like, or sorry, my daily energy expenditure is above 2,500, probably closer to between 2,500 and 3,000. So I was in a deficit, but I was only taking in lentils. And so I would look at my blood glucose level, and I'd also, of course, I would be feeling, I was looking at my blood glucose levels through a continuous glucose monitor. And of course, I knew how I was feeling. And I felt really like weak and I didn't feel well. And then my blood glucose was like in the 50s. And so I thought that was a very interesting experiment, because that's like a pure, super, super low fat diet. It's pure high carb. So I wonder if there's something to this idea that if you're burning glucose, there might be a time delay to switching back to fat burning. I think under most situations that this has been studied in the lab, this isn't what's driving the inability for people eating a highly processed diet, for example, to lose fat, especially because highly processed diets tend to be high in fat. So you are oxidizing, or you should be able to oxidize fat, especially once you start going into a calorie restricted state. You're just not going to want to go into a calorie restricted state because of the physiology that we talked about a little bit earlier. But so I think that there might be some effect here somewhere, a modest effect in the big scheme of things. I just think it seems to have been so far very difficult to untangle and to find that effect's impact on the ability for people to lose weight. So I suspect that effect in normal circumstances where people are eating normal amounts of fat, I suspect that effect is not a major effect, is modest or insignificant effect in people's ability or inability to actually lose weight. We don't know anything for sure in science. That's a possibility as far as we see it. So isn't the keto diet only a tool to achieve this and not a diet to keep it? Different people think different things. Some people think you should keep a ketogenic diet in the long term because that's the human diet. That's like the diet that humans evolved on, which isn't true. Some people think that. So you could cycle the ketogenic diet for sure. Use it sometimes in order to get into a deficit and to get into fat burning mode, especially if that works for you. And then other times just eat more carbohydrates and then just use that as this tool to cycle in and out. The one thing I would say people should try to do, and this is based on an exploratory analysis by John Little, it was published a year or two ago, is if you're on a ketogenic diet and you want to then switch back to a higher carbohydrate diet, don't eat a huge bolus of carbs and don't do it really fast, because you can really spike your blood glucose. And it's been shown in exploratory analyses, which really need to be verified and confirmed by future studies, but it's been shown in smaller studies that are still uncertain as far as whether they are adequately describing what's actually happening. But it has been suggested by these studies that your markers of vascular damage might increase in such a situation. So my advice would be to take things gradually. If you're on a ketogenic diet, then wean yourself onto a higher carbohydrate diet over the course of several days, and don't do it all of a sudden by eating a bunch of Rice Krispies. So that would be, or whatever other high carb food that you would want to eat. All right, and when I see effects of ketogenic diet in the body are blank blank blank, I'm thinking these effects don't last as long as we can eat low carb meals and vanish when we go for carbs. Okay, I'm trying to read this. When I see effects of ketogenic on the body, these effects don't last as long as we eat low carb meals and vanish when we go for carbs.
What I meant was when I started the ketogenic diets about 3 years ago, it was, to benefit from this diet. I mean, to gain the benefits like mental clarity, having energy all along, because my body can utilize my own fat to produce energy whatever if I ate an hour ago, 10 hours ago, or whatever. I wanted to have this energy all along, for example.
Yeah.
And when I see that, the ketogenic diet has these effects, mental clarity, whatever, I suppose that this doesn't last only if you eat low carb meals and then vanish whenever you go for a pizza or something. Your energy doesn't drop down, your mental clarity doesn't go off. So I was wondering, if we switch to a low carb diet on a daily basis to a high carb diet, are we going to keep the benefits of fat adaptation? This more about being fat adapted, having like this tool inside your body, rather than having a diet that you keep all day long.
Yeah. I think that's interesting. So the fat adaptation takes something like a week, meaning the corollary would be that most likely that going back to being predominantly carbohydrate burning would take a substantial amount of time as well. So yeah, I think that would be right. If you're fat adapted, you're going to stay fat adapted despite going off and on a ketogenic diet. Of course, you're going to sort of, it's kind of like you're on a large ship and you can't change directions really fast, but you are going to modestly cause your direction to slightly change more towards carbohydrate burning the more carbohydrates you do burn. But you'll overall, especially if carbohydrate intake is just every once in a while, you'll overall stay in a fat adapted state. Yeah. So I think, and if that's an advantage to you, and that clarity and remains, and you don't get those ups and downs that you might get if you eat more carbohydrates, which is as some people, which is I'm inferring from what you're saying that's kind of what you used to be experiencing. Then yeah, it makes sense to me that might be the case. So that makes sense to me. Saying most of the time being carbohydrate adapted, or sorry, fat adapted. The only caveat is earlier is that whenever you eat a high carb meal in the context of being very fat adapted and being on a ketogenic diet before, there might be some risk for blood vessel problems, maybe cardiovascular disease type problems. But that's very speculative, and we don't know that yet. That needs to be confirmed. But I mean, this is just an area that we're still learning about. So yeah, but what you say sounds plausible to me.
All right, thank you for your answer.
Did you say you kept the effect after a year?
Yeah, for example, there was a special thing that happened to me. I had a lot of spots, red spots on my back, for example. I didn't know where that came from. I thought perhaps it came from an allergy to some food, whatever. I went to a keto diet and the spots just vanished. They went off. And when I went back to a normal diet, let's say pescatarian diet, a year ago, the spots didn't reappear. So everything was like it was on the ketogenic diet. What I'm doing right now is I'm including a lot of intermittent fasting. So I try, for example, to have almost every day a 12 to 16 hour period where I don't eat anything. So I'm trying to benefit from both the intermittent fasting and a pescatarian diet, while
Yeah.
hoping to keep the bonuses I got from the keto diet a year ago. And it seems to last. I don't know if it will last forever. So that was the point of my question. Will it last forever? Is it logic, interesting? And you gave a good answer to this.
But for a year, so what I would say is we don't really know the mechanism. What kind of spots were they, out of curiosity? Like, were they like, was it like acne or was it like a rash?
Oh no, acne spots,
Uh-huh.
just like acne spots.
Yeah. So there's many things that could have changed from what you were doing then to the ketogenic diet, and maybe some of those things, even though you're on a different diet now, are still the same on this new diet. It's like, what I'm saying is like, this pescatarian diet that you're on, is it very similar to the diet that you were on before the ketogenic diet?
No, when I switched to the keto to the high carb diet, the diet was similar to the one I had before, which was an omnivorous diet with some eggs, some fish, some meat, and slowly over time I switched in a year to an omnivore diet to a pescatarian diet.
Okay.
So I made some changes after the switch from keto to high carb.
Right. And so the diet that you went on, so basically you were on a high carb diet, then you were on a keto diet, then you went on an omnivorous diet, then you went on a pescatarian diet. And this omnivorous diet this omnivorous diet though is the same as the diet that you were on before the ketogenic diet, and you still didn't have the effects. You just still didn't have the acne on your back.
Yep.
All right. Well,
so that's just an anecdote.
What about your body weight? Was your body weight the same?
My body weight dropped down. I mean, I lost 3 kilograms when I switched to keto. I gained them back, and then my body weight didn't change. I mean, my face was a little more lean. Like my bones would appear a little more. I was looking more fit while being on a ketogenic diet, and I kept that fit appearance when I switched to the high carb diet.
Yeah. I don't know the answer to this. I mean, it's possible that some sort of long-term epigenetic thing changed in you so that you're expressing genes differently now than you were before, and that's possible. Probably likely that something like that has happening to some degree, but I don't think we know. It's probably, I mean, maybe lifestyle, the fact that you're extra. I don't think we know. I wish we knew. It'd be great, but all right. So, can you get the effects of a ketogenic diet with a high carb diet if you supplement ketone esters? Yeah. So the ketogenic diet supplemented with ketone esters is sort of a hybrid metabolic state. It's not the same as ketosis, and it's not the same as, although it's technically defined as ketosis, that you have higher blood ketone levels. But the metabolic state, the actual way that you're burning energy in your cells, is different than if you're on strictly ketogenic diet. And actually, the cells and different cells will be different because the insulin will be different. There's a lot of things that are going to be quite different. So you're in kind of a hybrid state when you have a high carbohydrate diet supplemented with ketone esters. But you might get some of the benefits if some of the benefits are conferred by the ketone bodies themselves, which is you might get some of the benefits to, I don't know, cognition. You might get some of the benefits to cancer, but it's not clear, and we don't know. Just to reiterate, we don't have good, strong human evidence that cognition and cancer are modulated by ketones, so we don't actually know. To piggyback, though, off of what I said about cognition and ketones, they are going to, okay, so those MCT trials, those ketone trials I was talking about earlier with medium chain triglycerides, those got ketones levels up only about maybe 1 or 1.5 millimolar. There's new trials coming up where they're looking at ketone esters, which get ketones up to about 3 or 4 millimolar. So maybe they'll find benefits there where they haven't found benefits with the medium chain triglycerides. So these are still open questions. And so to turn back to your question one more time, if the benefits are conferred by the ketones, and if we find some benefit by the ketones themselves, then yes, you should be able to get some of the benefits of a ketogenic diet without taking the ketogenic diet, just by taking the ketone esters. But again, we don't exactly know what those benefits are precisely yet. What is the underlying mechanism by which you say keto might honestly increase lifespan? There's so many mechanisms. One of them might be insulin signaling. So it's thought that in these preclinical models, if you look at these C. elegans, these tiny like worms that you have to look at under the microscope, and you look at different model organisms, I think it's even been done in mice as well, and like xenopus, like zebrafish, and all these other model organisms that they've modulated insulin signaling and found that the organisms live a lot longer. So maybe the ketogenic diet might work through the same mechanism. So if you're on a ketogenic diet, you're having maybe about half as much insulin signaling, maybe as little as a quarter, probably closer to half, depending upon the studies that you're looking at. So that might be one mechanism. And of course, the antioxidant effects and these signaling effects. GPR109A is the receptor for beta hydroxybutyrate, and GPR109A might confer some anti-cancer properties. So there might be, and then there's this whole question of whether ketones may reduce cell growth itself. And I have some preliminary data in my lab, which is actually kind of conflicting. I'm trying to figure out why my cells are responding differently in different ways. But there's some evidence, and it goes back to the 1970s, maybe 1961, by McGee, that shows that ketones inhibit the proliferation of cells. So if you're basically just slowing your body's growth rate down, then presumably, like many different kinds of cells, then presumably in some contexts, maybe not in an immune context, but in some contexts, that might be good for slowing down aging. These are just all speculative mechanisms, though, and many of them, maybe even all of them, may not pan out. So, but that's just some thoughts. Does a ketogenic diet have any effects on the immune system? Yes, probably. And do we understand them very well? Not very well. So there's a study that was done with mice where they showed that if you inject them with these infectious pathogens, they bacterial pathogens, and also with LPS, you inject them with LPS, both have the same effect. They will stop eating. So this is part of the sickness syndrome I was talking about earlier. Whenever you get certain kinds of sickness and illness, you don't want to eat anything. And they showed that going into this sickness syndrome state of not eating anything was necessary for properly fighting off the infection and for these mice continuing to live. And they suggested that one of the means by which this could happen was through ketones. The experiment that really needed to conclusively be done to demonstrate that this was for sure the case wasn't done, but it was a really good story. And it was from Medsitov's lab. He's at Yale College of Medicine, and it was a couple years ago. What they also showed, though, is if you put the mice into a ketogenic diet prior to injection, then you actually reduce the survival. So it seems to be some sort of choreographed sequence whereby we get a pathogen load that causes us to have the sickness, and then our body goes into an alternative metabolic state. This alternative metabolic state modulates immune function and is important. And immune function must be modulated metabolically. It's an part of immune function that's just beginning to be explored by this field called immunometabolism, which is a fascinating field. Yeah, it's thought that you need this particular sequence of events to happen, including this sickness syndrome, in order to maximize immune function. Artificially inducing it by going into ketogenic diet prior to becoming sick might actually have adverse consequences. On the other hand, there's another study that showed that whenever you give animals an intranasal injection of influenza, then if they're on a ketogenic diet, they're more resistant to it. The problem with this study is there's multiple, the study design, the diet design was not really proper to actually answer that question or address that question because the diets were so incredibly mismatched. I actually wrote a letter about this to the editor that wasn't published. We're going to try to turn it into something else. The diets were so mismatched that I don't think you can really conclude that the ketogenic diet is responsible for that effect. It could be something else that's changing. There's a million other things that could have been changing there. Yes, it's ketones and metabolism, glucose metabolism, fatty acid metabolism, all different aspects of metabolism are really important for modulating immune function. We really don't understand how that works that well yet, and that field is just in its beginnings. Yeah, I don't know how to answer that question about changing from a ketogenic diet to omnivore pescatarian. I don't know how this mental clarity thing works. Here's something I'll say. Personally, I just say anecdotally. I used to be I'm still on a very high carb diet, and I used to every time I ate, I would basically pass out. I would need to sleep really badly every single time. And I just didn't feel well. And if I tried to have a conversation after I just ate, I would almost be unable to have a reasonable conversation. Over the last 2 years or 1 or 2 years, I've gotten very fit in that time. I've gained a lot of muscle, and I like just overall just very fit. And now that I have a high carb diet, I don't feel anything. I don't get drowsy at all. So sometimes I wonder whether changes in physiology, maybe even just related to having more muscle mass to take up glucose, I'm not sure, might modulate some of these impacts on mental clarity in response to diet. I'm not really sure. That's just my anecdote. What I'm saying is, like, many things can impinge upon these supposed mental clarity benefits that are unrelated to diet, or are related to diet but are unrelated to ketogenesis per se, that are changing over time, that you're not even noticing are changing, or you're adopting practices with fasting to keep weight down, and that might have some effect on mental clarity. So yeah, this is like part of the reason why I don't trust anecdotes, is because for me personally, I've experienced so many different things and so many different diets because I've tried everything. I'm super open-minded. And what I've concluded after all this is I don't know what's going on. The only way I'll know what's going on is either by doing an N of 1 crossover, which are extremely difficult to do because you have to control everything that you're doing, or just by having randomized controlled trials. So those are the kinds of things I trust. I don't really trust anecdotes, because not that these aren't real, not that people aren't having these real effects, but there's so many other things in life that can change over the course of a year besides diet, even including living situation, the relationships you have, your coping practices for stress, all these other things that can be changing at the same time, your vitamin status, like, who knows what is actually driving the effect of the that you're observing? Is it the keto diet? Is that the are you thinking it's the keto diet because that's the only thing you're really focusing on? Well, that might not be the thing that's actually changing, that's causing the effect. So that's all I'll say. Does ketogenic diet affect body temperature? I'm not aware that it does. I'm not aware that it does. It could. I'm not sure. Any other questions? So I think that yeah. Leptin and ghrelin. Yeah. Great. There was this one study that came out that that showed that people who had lost weight, I think it was a single arm study. I want to say it was single arm. They lost weight on a ketogenic diet, and they saw that ghrelin was not substantially, I want to say ghrelin was not substantially raised after weight loss, and leptin was not substantially lowered after weight loss. And then they reintroduced all their old, and then they found out that leptin went down and ghrelin went up, and they also reported more hunger, etc., even after being at the same weight. So the conclusion that some people make is, okay, maybe there's something about this ketogenic diet that allows people to lose weight and keep it off without their hunger hormones going in the wrong direction, which causes them to gain weight back again. So maybe keto is really great for maintaining weight loss so long to it. All right, here's the issue with that, and it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is that compared to what? So compared to the standard American diet, we are just reintroducing all of, yeah, sure, maybe the ketogenic diet might have beneficial effects on ghrelin and leptin. These are hormones that are controlling your hunger and your appetite levels. But what if you switch them onto a less standard American diet? You switch them onto a whole plant-based diet. Would you still see those adverse changes in leptin and ghrelin, or would you maintain those changes, or would they go in a positive direction? So we don't really know. So we know that relative to the standard American diet, for many people and in many studies, it has been shown that ketogenic diet is going to have beneficial effects on weight loss so long as you're adherent to it. But do we know that that's also the case compared to other diets like a whole food plant-based diet? And that's why this new study that's coming out with Kevin Hall is so interesting, because he looks at that question to some extent. Have I heard anything about bariatric patients? I haven't. I haven't heard anything about patients who have had bariatric surgery trying the ketogenic diet. Probably need ketones. Can't even talk today. Questions? Is there anything you want to talk about? I want to listen. Can you overdose on ketone esters? In theory, you maybe could. Like if you took way too many. Like if you took like 3 bottles in a row, maybe could you go into ketoacidosis? You have high ketone levels. You would become a little bit acidotic in your blood. Your acid load would go up a little bit. I don't think so. Maybe. All right. Yeah. I'm not sure. Maybe. That's an interesting question. We can talk about that next time. And thank you so much. for saying that. That's so nice of you to say that. All right, I think I'm done here. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for listening to that episode of Diet Wars. If you would like to make a donation and you appreciate the time that I put into this and would like to help support me in making more episodes and better episodes and getting better people on and flying all around the world and going to beaches. No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. If you would just like to help me make sure we make this the best possible podcast that we can make it and the best nutrition science podcast on the internet, which someday I believe that this will be. Go to Patreon. My Patreon account is, I think, www.patreon.com and then /Kevin in Bass. That's Kevin in. So there's two N's, like Kevin with two N's. Bass, Bass. And you should be able to find my Patreon account there. You should also check Avi and I out on Twitter at Kevin in Bass. It's the same thing. Kevin with two N's, Bass on Twitter, and then Avi Bit, AVIBITT, and that's on Twitter. You should check both of us out, especially Avi, because he's more brilliant than he had the chance to show in this particular podcast, because I was doing most of the talking. But next episode, he will be doing most of the talking, and you should stay tuned for that one, because that's going to be something you're not going to be able to hear anywhere else. So with that, check us out. Check out our Discords. Check out our Twitter accounts. Join our Discords. Give us a message. Learn more about nutrition science. Promote good nutrition science everywhere. And tell the people who are doing bad nutrition science and spreading bad nutrition science that they should stop. This is Kevin signing out. Peace.